Anthony Edwards is getting a lot of heat for what he said in an interview recently, in which he basically said the generations before him were less talented. He took a shot specifically at Michael Jordan's generation. I'm going to read the quotes and what he said that's drew all this heat among NBA fans. I would say mainly older NBA fans, not so much the younger generation, which I would say is Gen Z, maybe some really young millennials. But anyways, I'm going to read what he just said. I didn't watch it back in the day, so I can't speak on it. They say it was tougher back then than it is now, but I don't think anybody had skill back then. Michael Jordan was the only one that really had skill. You know what I mean? So that's why when they saw Kobe Bryant, they were like, oh my God. But now everybody has skill. So the way I interpret this is that this was just a young guy just being a typical young guy, which is always the mentality that what I grew up with is better than what you grew up with in the past. And only because what I saw today, I assume it's just better simply because it's today. So it has to be better because the present is always better than the past. That's what I look at this comment mainly for. But there is some ignorance in that by saying that Michael Jordan was the only person that had skill back then. There were a lot of guys with skill back then during the Jordan era, I would say. They just the top-notch guys I would say from that era was Clyde Drexler. He was the second best shooting guard during the 90s. He only won one championship, but he was an amazing player. His athleticism was like on the same level as Michael Jordan. It was very close. Jordan may have been a little bit a hair more athletic than him, but it was really up there. In this era, Clyde would just be as good he was in the 90s. Like he had the skills, he had the ball handling skills, he had the driving abilities, the slashing. Heck, I think Clyde would probably be better than Anthony Edwards today because Clyde was a legit 6'7". Anthony Edwards looks like he's 6'4". Plus, he's as athletic as Anthony Edwards was, well, is currently. So I think he would be great in this era. He had a lot of skills. You look at a guy like John Stockton, just arguably the greatest playmaking point guard of all time. His playmaking was out of this world great. Just why wouldn't he do well today? He also had a good three-point shot. Just it doesn't make any sense. He probably would be better because you couldn't be physical with him like back then versus today where it's hard to guard perimeter players. I don't see how he wouldn't be a better player. You look at just other perimeter players of that era, Grant Hill, when he was in his prime and he was healthy, he was ridiculously skilled. He was probably the guy you would want today in this era, a guy who's 6'8", great ball handling skills, and can get you 6-7 assists. Keep in mind, he was getting like 6-7 assists during the 90s when the offense and the pace of the game was a lot slower and it didn't allow you that many opportunities to rack up assists. In this era, he could have a season where he's getting you 8 to 10 assists. Plus, he was super athletic. He had a good post-up game in the paint. He had an array of just moves he could pull on you. You're telling me that this guy wasn't skilled? I have a hard time believing that. There was, I'm trying to think of some other people. Scottie Pippen, who when he was in his prime was, I would say, about just as good as Grant Hill. Not as good of a scorer, but he had the same skill set. You're telling me Scottie wouldn't thrive in this era? I just don't believe that. His athleticism is amazing. Just how many guys do you know in this league that are currently 6'8", like Scottie Pippen, that has like a 7'7" wingspan, that has out of this world ball handling skills and out of this world athleticism, along with the ability to slash to the hole? I don't think you can really list anybody in this current league that can do what Scottie Pippen once did back then. Just he was great. You just look at these other guys when it comes to skills. Like I'm trying to think of some other people from the top of my head, but just when it comes to perimeter players, Mitch Richmond, this guy was super big. He was built like a truck. He was like a 6'5" shooting guard. He was big as hell, very physical, could score, was a great scorer, had a great jump shot. You're telling me that he wouldn't be good in this era? That he didn't have the skill set to play? He probably would be even better knowing how you're not allowed to be physical with perimeter players. Just And I'm just mentioning the perimeter players right now, but another guy, Penny Hardaway, just this guy would have also been great in this era too. He was a legit point guard back then. The man was like 6'7" with ridiculous athleticism, great playmaking skill. He was also good at posting up smaller guards in the paint. He had a jump shot too. Just how the hell would he not be good in this era? Like when it comes to skills, just how many guys are like this currently in this era that have Penny Hardaway's skills? That's a natural. That's a great point guard, 6'7" and super athletic, but can also be a scorer when it has to be a scorer. Just I don't really see many guys like that today in this era. I can't even think of anybody right now from the top of my head that has that ability. And then you have other guys like Reggie Miller. Reggie Miller was basically a more alpha version of Klay Thompson back then, if we're being honest. A guy who could be a leader of the team, carry a team. Just his game was very similar to Klay. You're telling me he wouldn't be great? Just he had a skill set. And I'm only mentioning 90s perimeter players, but we get more into detail about this. Just like, what about the bigs back then? Hakeem Olajuwon, just again, like how many bigs would be more skilled to them today in this era than him? At least when it comes to post moves, there's nobody that would have his post moves from that era. David Robinson, he was basically Anthony Davis on steroids, a taller version of David, a taller version of Anthony Davis, just super built and not injury prone. I don't see how he would struggle in this era when Anthony Davis is like a lesser version of him and he's doing fine. Granted, he's brittle, but you see what I'm saying? Just it doesn't add up. Patrick Ewing would just be as good in this era, I believe, as he was during the 90s, maybe even better, because Ewing actually did have a 3-point shot, but he wasn't allowed to shoot the ball a lot from that far away because it was not heard of back then for centers to shoot threes. But in this era, he would be fine. He would be basically just as good. I don't see any difference. He was just limited in what he could do when it came to shooting because it was unconventional for a 7-footer to shoot back then. And I'm just naming some of the top people right now for the 90s, but even second tier guys like Glenn Robinson, Jamal Mashburn, these were big, small forwards. These guys are 6'8", 250 pounds, and they were playing the small forward position, and they had great jump shots. Like, I can't imagine how they wouldn't be skillful in this era. This era probably would be better and kinder to them when it comes to the style of play. Larry Johnson, he was a super athletic 6'7" power forward. I think this era probably would have been better for him because it would favor small ball more so than the previous era did. I don't see how he would struggle. And I'm just naming you some 90s guys, but I haven't named all of them because I can go on all day about how all these top 90s players, whether they were superstars, stars, or just above average players, of why they would do well in the current era. And if I go to even the 2000s, just strictly naming off the top perimeter players, Allen Iverson, just these rules favor him today more so back then, just because of physicality. You could somewhat contain him, but today, you wouldn't really be able to touch him, and his speed was out of this world. Again, his skill set would translate. I look at other guys, Vince Carter. I remember one of the biggest hangups of Vince Carter in the previous era was he hated the physical play. He didn't like it. He would always complain and whine and cry to the refs, and guys would get physical with him, foul him hard. In this era, he doesn't have to worry about it. And I really use him as an example because I remember when Vince came into the league, guys had a lot of pride. They didn't like to get dunked on. They would give him dirty fouls, really hard-ass fouls that today would get you ejected and suspended. I remember this one play where back in the day, he was playing against the Pacers where Dale Davis just did a rock bottom, like literally a rock bottom move on him, where he went up for a dunk and he just slammed him as hard as he could. Vince fell on his shoulder, was in just a lot of pain, and all Dale got was a flagrant, not an ejection, not a suspension, or nothing. Can you imagine today Vince not having to worry about getting the shit fouled out of him today? He just doesn't have to worry about that at all. How great he would be today, just being able to roam in the paint and not have to worry about being decked or slammed or mugged. Just his skill set would greatly translate to this era. I look at another guy, Tracy McGrady, who hated the physical play. I felt his career was shortened due to all the hard hits he had to take on his body that now today he wouldn't have to worry about because it'll be the same deal as his cousin Vince, that these guys wouldn't be able to touch him, and he would be free to roam and get whatever bucket he wanted to. He was a great scorer, but his career was shortened due to all the hard fouls he had to take. Just his skill set would translate today. So I can continue to name some other guys too, just from the top of my head, but I just think this was the ignorant take from Anthony Edwards. I know I went on this long rant. If you're still watching it, great, but I had to do that. I just think there's a lot of ignorance that comes from each generation when they look back and they try to diss the previous one without actually just watching game tape and learning about it. It's like how I once thought Wilt Chamberlain was overrated because he played against like YMCA guys. That was my perception of him. But then I watched some videos of him. I watched some game tape of him, especially towards the end of his career when he was facing against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and saw how he held his own despite being really old. And I could tell that Wilt was a generational talent, that just by watching that footage that he would do great in any era. And just I feel that's the case with a lot of great players. They would be great in just about any era, and just to dismiss a whole generation of players is just stupid. But I'm not surprised. This is Anthony Edwards showing his youth and his ignorance by saying what he said. So just that's all I had to say.